All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to How to Gain Admission to Stanford and Ivy League Universities. I'm Dan Lee, and I'm here with Vitaly Borshan, and we are the co-founders and senior admissions consultants at Solomon Admissions Consulting. So first off, I'd like to introduce you to the college admissions consulting team at Solomon Admissions Consulting. We have a very large group of former admissions officers at Ivy League schools, as well as other top schools, including Stanford, UChicago, and MIT. A lot of these people are former associate directors of admission at these universities, as well as former assistant directors of admission. And as you can see, we have people from Cornell, University of Pennsylvania, Stanford, UChicago, MIT, Dartmouth, Penn, Columbia, etc. So the first question is, why care? Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford reject over 60% of students who have both a perfect 4.0 unweighted GPA and a perfect 1600 on the SAT or 2400 on the old SAT. And Stanford in particular rejects over 70% of the students with perfect SAT scores. So here are the 2016-2017 average acceptance rates at universities across the nation. And so the first column will have the name of the university. The second column will have the average acceptance rate nationally at that university over a decade ago in 2005. The third column is the acceptance rate at that particular university last year. And the fourth column has the acceptance rate of our particular students at that particular university. So for instance, Columbia University over a decade ago in 2005 had an acceptance rate of 12%. The national acceptance rate at Columbia University last year in 2016 was 5.8%, and last year 24.3% of Solomon admission students who applied to Columbia were accepted at Columbia. Another example would be Stanford. Stanford back in 2005 had a 13% acceptance rate. Last year in 2016, they had the lowest acceptance rate of any national university in the country at 4.6%. And last year, 29.5% of Solomon admission students who applied to Stanford were accepted by Stanford. So as you can see, the acceptance rates across the nation have dropped by over 50% in the past decade. How elite colleges evaluate applicants. So every elite college gives an applicant scores based on both their academic and their personal profile. So roughly 25% of the evaluation process is looking at your grades, your class rank, and your course difficulty. So obviously, the more AP courses that you've taken, the higher your course difficulty or course rigor score will be. Another 25% is given to your SAT-1/ACT scores, as well as your SAT-2 subject test scores. And a lot of students overlook the subject test scores. The subject test scores, for the purpose of college admissions, tend to be much more important than your AP scores. 25% of your overall score is your personal statement, your supplemental essays, as well as the addendum explaining any academic anomalies in your transcript. So for instance, if you had a bad semester or a bad year and it was due to problems, family problems, or due to a learning difference that you were recently diagnosed with, that is something that needs to be explained away intelligently in what's called the additional information section of the common application. And all three of those components are improvable at the time of your application. The other 25% is given to your activity sheet. A lot of our students will submit a separate brag sheet that details their activities and their accomplishments, the interview, as well as your recommendation letters. That is all improvable at the time of application. And keep in mind, at the end of the presentation, I will be taking any questions that you have. And so there will be a live question and answer session at the end. Feel free to ask me any of your questions during the presentation, and I will answer as many of them as I can get around to at the end of the presentation. So how does Stanford evaluate applicants? So at Stanford, like at many top schools, your GPA is recalculated. So Stanford has a very set way of recalculating your GPA. So first off, Stanford looks at your grades from 10th and 11th grade only. So they don't look at any grades from freshman year. And this is particularly a good thing if you, for instance, didn't do well your freshman year. Another school that does not look at your freshman year grades is Princeton. And the UC schools like Berkeley and UCLA also do not look at your freshman year grades. Stanford looks at academic courses only. So if you took physical education, typing, band, or orchestra, those are not counted in the recalculation of your GPA. And Stanford also does what's called flat grading, and that's where an A- becomes an A, which is great if you have an A- or 2 on your transcript, and a B+ becomes a B, which is bad if you have a lot of B+, because that actually gets downgraded to a B when they recalculate your GPA. Let's talk about the Stanford applicant rating system. So Stanford assigns every applicant 3 separate ratings on a 1 to 6 scale, 1 being the highest and 6 being the lowest. So Stanford assigns every applicant what's called an academic rating on a 1 to 6 scale, 1 being the highest, 6 being the lowest. And the academic rating is simply looking at your GPA, your test scores, as well as your course rigor. The second rating that Stanford assigns every applicant is the extracurricular rating, 1 to 6, 1 being the highest. And they are particularly looking for students who are specialists with national recognition in one area. They're not looking for students who are well-rounded. So they're, like most top schools, they look for angular students. And the third rating that Stanford gives everyone is what's called the intellectual vitality rating on a 1 to 6 scale, 1 being the highest. And this separate intellectual vitality rating is unique to schools such as Stanford and Chicago that give you a separate intellectual vitality rating. And this is really measuring whether you love learning for the sake of learning outside the classroom. And students who rate highest on the intellectual vitality rating have often done research with a professor, leading oftentimes to publication or to national awards outside the classroom. So let's talk about what a student with an intellectual vitality rating of 1 out of 6, which is the highest, would entail. So a student who's an intellectual vitality 1 at Stanford has done independent academic research outside the classroom with a college professor, leading to published research in a journal. They have written a phenomenal Stanford intellectual vitality supplemental essay, which we'll get to later. And they will also have shown a true love of learning for the sake of learning at a high level outside the classroom. So when Stanford looks at intellectual vitality, Stanford is really asking, does the applicant take ownership of his or her education outside the classroom? Is the applicant the kind of student who would enrich the learning experience of other Stanford students? And most importantly, is the applicant passionate about learning? So basically, this rating is used to weed out perfect students who don't actually love learning, which unfortunately applies to a lot of students. So one of the most important supplemental essays that Stanford asks each year is what's called their intellectual vitality essay, and the prompt has been the same for the past several years, and the prompt is, Stanford students possess an intellectual vitality. Reflect on an idea or experience that has been important to your intellectual development, 250 words max. So this essay is one of the most important supplemental essays, if not the most important supplemental essay at Stanford. I call this the never-ending dinner conversation essay because it's really used to weed out perfect students who are not intellectuals, who get perfect grades and test scores for the sake of getting into Stanford and getting a high-paying job, not because they actually love learning. And so they're really using this to weed out valedictorians who really don't like learning that much. And this question is testing whether you really love learning for the sake of learning or for the sake of getting into Stanford. If it's the latter, they're going to try to weed you out using this question. So a bad answer to the intellectual vitality question at Stanford is one, for instance, that talks about Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States, which applicants often use to study for the AP US History exam. So they're not looking for students who are studying for exams to get a high test score or a grade. That's the last thing they're looking for. They're looking for students who really love learning and who don't really care about grades that much within the context of learning. I mean, they're looking for students who prioritize learning over just getting high scores, you know? A great answer to the intellectual vitality question addresses one intellectual idea which reveals your love of learning far beyond the classroom walls for the sake of learning, one idea that can be translated to undergraduate research at a university, an academic publication at Stanford, and is hopefully related to your academic major or future career goals. So ideally, your intellectual vitality essay should relate to whatever academic positioning you have in your overall application, and we'll touch on that a little bit later in terms of what that means. So there are some stark differences between the admission system at Stanford and Ivy League schools. So unlike Ivy League schools, Stanford often admits the most compelling applicant, not necessarily the most qualified applicant on paper. So we talked about the rating system at Stanford, the rating for academic, extracurricular, as well as intellectual vitality. Stanford will often take students who rate slightly lower on the scale, but who are more compelling, over students who rate higher on the scale, but who are less compelling. At Ivy League schools, generally speaking, the students who rate the highest tend to get in over the students who rate lower. Stanford tends to weigh the SATs less than the Ivies. They also weigh the supplemental essays more heavily than the Ivies, and that goes back to the fact that Stanford's looking for the most compelling applicant, not necessarily the most qualified applicant. And so Stanford puts an enormous amount of weight in their supplemental essays. And so at a place like Stanford, once your ratings across the academic and intellectual vitality and extracurricular scales are high enough, it almost becomes an essay writing contest at that point. Another thing that differentiates Stanford is that Stanford weighs legacy status and athletic recruiting more heavily than the Ivies. Stanford has about twice as many recruited athletes as a percentage of the population as the Ivies. And they also give more preference to legacy status than the Ivies do. So if you're a legacy at Stanford and you apply early action, and you have very good grades and test scores, it's very rare that Stanford will flat out reject you during the early action stage if you're a legacy. Stanford also, as we discussed, assigns applicants a separate intellectual vitality rating. At Ivy League schools, what a lot of Ivy League schools will do is they won't assign you a separate intellectual vitality rating, but they will incorporate intellectual vitality into your academic rating, which is one of two ratings that most Ivy League schools give you. And the other thing to keep in mind is Stanford does not give as big a boost to early action applicants who are not hooked. And so these are students who don't have a parent who went to Stanford or are not recruited athletes or development cases. If you don't fall in those categories, applying early action to Stanford is not very advantageous relative to early action or early decision at other top schools. So how do Ivy League schools evaluate applicants? So Ivy League schools assign every applicant two separate ratings on varying scales, but often on a 1 to 9 scale, such as at Dartmouth is on a 1 to 9 scale. So the academic rating is on a 1 to 9 scale, 1 being the lowest, 9 being the highest. And the personal rating is also on a 1 to 9 scale, 1 being the lowest, 9 being the highest. And we're just using Dartmouth as an example here. A lot of the top Ivy League schools use a similar rating system to Dartmouth, but not identical. It'll be on different scales, like 1 to 5 at Brown, and it varies depending on the school. So an academic rating of 9 out of 9, which is the highest of the Ivies, someone who has a rating of 9 out of 9 would have the following characteristics: would be in the top 1 to 2% of his or her high school class, would have taken the most rigorous and challenging load of AP courses, so taking pretty much almost all the AP courses, if not all the AP courses that your high school offers, would have SAT 1, ACT, and SAT 2 scores in the 99th percentile or higher, would have glowing letters of recommendation indicating the student is best out of applicants from the past several years from his or her high school, and the student would also display an intense level of learning as evidenced by academic research outside the classroom with a college professor, leading to publication in a journal, and has the potential to be a leader in an academic field in the future. That's what would be considered an academic 9 out of 9, which is the highest. I mean, if you're simply a student who has a perfect GPA and a perfect SAT score, oftentimes you would only be an academic 7 out of 9 at a place like Dartmouth. So let's talk about a student who has an academic rating of 7 out of 9. This student would often be in the top 5% of his or her high school class, have taken the most challenging course load of AP courses, have SAT, ACT, and SAT 2 scores above the 95th percentile, strong but unexceptional letters of recommendation, and lacking the intense love of learning of academic 9s with some independent reading outside the classroom, but no published research with a college professor, And this student is often driven to achieve more by competition than by a true love of learning. And these students have a very difficult time getting into the top schools. So Ivy League schools also give you a personal rating, and the personal rating is at a place like Dartmouth, for instance. It's on a 9-point scale. So someone who has a personal rating of 9 out of 9, which is the highest, these would be examples of students who have 9 out of 9. These students would be very angular and kind of the best in the country at one thing. So examples would be someone who's a published author, someone who is an Intel SPS finalist, which is the top 40 in the country, Olympic medalist, someone who soloed at Carnegie Hall, U.S. Math Olympiad qualifier, awards at the national level, and somebody who has a patent pending, obviously without parental involvement. So let's talk about a personal rating of 7 out of 9. So this would be someone who's less angular, who's a bit more on the well-rounded side. And like I said, the top schools are looking for students who are specialists. They are not looking for students who are well-rounded. So someone with a personal rating of 7 out of 9, which is solid but not exceptional, would be somebody who has awards at the regional level, significant commitment at a high level to a few activities, such as student body president, all-state orchestra, captain of a varsity sports team, nationally ranked debater. And this student would be well-rounded and involved, but not the most passionate about anything. And the best line to sum up this student would be someone who's a jack of all trades, a master of none. And this student typically has a very difficult time getting into Ivy League schools. Let's talk about the separate Ivy League engineering admissions process. So there's a separate engineering admissions process at Columbia, Cornell, and Penn within the Ivies. And some of the things to consider are that, number one, the engineering faculty are on the admissions committee when there's a separate engineering admissions process. And so there's a greater emphasis on numbers and test scores because that's what engineering professors like. And there's also a greater emphasis on academic research in engineering. And so oftentimes, successful applicants to engineering tend to have extremely high numbers, good extracurriculars related to engineering, but not necessarily the most compelling applications because of the fact that engineering faculty are looking for very high numbers and research. A very important to consider, a very important question that I'm sure many of you are considering is, should I apply early decision or early action by the November 1st deadline? So the majority of Ivy League and other top universities fill approximately 50% of the available seats in their incoming freshman class through early decision or early action applicants who submit their application by November 1st. So the advantage conferred by applying early decision or early action is the academic equivalent of adding 150 points to your SAT score. Early decision and early action applicants at schools not named Harvard, Stanford, Yale, and Princeton compete against a much weaker applicant pool. So for instance, if you're applying early decision to Duke, you're competing against a much weaker applicant pool than if you apply regular decision to Duke, because the early decision applicants to Duke are not competing against the students who are applying early to Harvard, Stanford, Yale, Princeton, or the students who are applying early to a place like Columbia or Dartmouth. Second, your application is read much more closely since there's more time to spend on each applicant. And borderline applicants who are waitlisted regular decision would most likely have gotten in had they applied early decision or early action in many cases. So it's very important to pick your early decision or early action school very carefully. It's a calculated risk that you're taking, and this is definitely something that we work with a lot of students on in terms of making sure that they pick the right early decision or early action school, because oftentimes if you pick a school that's too far out of range, it's a complete waste of that strategy, simply because early decision and early action are meant to reward students who take smart and calculated risks. It's not meant to reward students who are applying to a school that's completely out of their reach. That's not what it's meant for. Let's look at some of the Ivy League early decision and early action statistics. And so, for instance, Brown University, last year, the acceptance rate for early decision applicants at Brown was 20%. The regular decision acceptance rate at Brown was 7.2%. And Brown filled 38% of their incoming freshman class through early decision. Another school that we'll look at is Yale. Yale last year had a single restrictive early action acceptance rate of 16%. Their regular decision acceptance rate was 4.7%. And obviously there's no stats on the percent of the freshman class filled through early action because it's non-binding. Let's talk about special considerations for Asian American and Indian applicants and South Asian applicants. So about 50% of the students we work with are high achieving South Asian, Indian, and Asian American applicants. They face a tremendous number of discrimination issues at the top schools, and we're going to just kind of go into some of them right now. So here are some quotes from major news outlets such as the New York Times and the Boston Globe. And these quotes, you can read them to yourself, are addressing the heightened bar for admission for Asian American and South Asian applicants. So let's talk about the heightened bar for admission. So there was a study done in 1997 that compared the applications of Asian American applicants at a number of highly selective colleges to that of other applicants in the applicant pool. And the study found that given similarly qualified applicants in terms of GPA and SAT scores and extracurricular activities, it was statistically shown that relative to equally qualified Asian, South Asian, and Indian American applicants at elite colleges, that similarly qualified white applicants are 3 times as likely to be admitted, given the same qualifications as an Asian American or South Asian applicant. Similarly qualified legacy applicants were 6 times as likely to be admitted as an equally qualified Asian American or South Asian applicant. And similarly qualified recruited athletes were 20 times as likely to be admitted. To be accepted to top private universities, Asian American students need to score an average SAT score, which is 140 points higher than white students. This was a 2009 study. Over the past 20 years, the percentage of Asian American students at Ivy League universities has remained the same at 17 to 20%. In comparison, the percentage of Asian Americans at UC Berkeley, where it became illegal to consider race in admissions, has jumped to 45%. And while the number of Asian American applicants to Harvard has almost tripled in the past 2 decades, there were actually fewer Asian American students admitted to the university in 2012 than there were 20 years ago in 1992. So this chart shows the number of Asian American students, college-age students, age 18 to 20, and elite college enrollment trends over the past 2.5 decades. And so you can see that at every school, you can see that the number of Asian American students who are college age has drastically gone up over the past 2 decades, but the enrollment figures at top schools, with the exception of Caltech, has remained constant. And so Caltech's the only university where the percentage of Asian American students applying that has increased has been reflected in the percentage of Asian American students in the incoming class, where almost 40% of the incoming, over 40% of the incoming class is Asian American. And you will see that, that's often the case because Caltech is the most meritocratic admissions process of any elite school in the country. They don't consider affirmative action or anything in terms of legacy advantage, any of that stuff in their admissions process. It's purely based on merit. And Caltech is a school where the admissions committee is composed solely of professors at the university, not admissions officers. Let's talk about some common perceptions. The common perception is that elite colleges have many Asian and Indian applicants, and that must be counted in the application. So number one, Asians are notorious for being pre-professionally oriented, often majoring in the same field. So a lot of the Asian American students we work with, I would say the vast majority of them are either pre-med, pre-engineering, or pre-business, and that's fine. But for the purpose of the application, that's not something you necessarily want to advertise simply because it'll lump you in with all the other Asian American and South Asian students who want to do computer science or biology or go into finance and go to Wall Street. Secondly, Asians tend to have a homogeneous set of extracurricular interests, such as stereotypically Asian extracurriculars like tennis, violin, math team. Unfortunately, Harvard isn't going to want 400 Asian pre-meds and engineers to excel at piano, tennis, math in its freshman class of 1,600. They are building a class, and 400 Asian pre-meds and engineers are not on the list of goals. Very important to keep in mind. Columbia University in New York City could fill their incoming freshman class 4 to 5 times over. 4 to 5 times over With high-achieving Asian American students who won science awards, who have close to perfect GPAs and perfect test scores, obviously they choose not to do that. Those students get rejected. And Asian American students and South Asian students are often viewed as quiet, diligent students who don't rock the boat. Unfortunately, this is not what elite colleges are looking for, and far too many essays and recommendation letters reinforce this stereotype of the quiet student. They're not looking for quiet students. They're looking for students who are going to really challenge their classmates, and you have to communicate that in the application. Let's talk about strategic positioning and crafting one's narrative. So what is strategic positioning? It's simply a fancy way of saying how are you going to make yourself stand out from the crowd. So strategic positioning is positioning one's strengths against an institution or college's weaknesses. So the tennis analogy, I mean, this is very apt because the U.S. Open is starting this week. If any of you watch tennis in the U.S. Open, you know, Federer, Nadal, obviously whenever Nadal plays Federer, Nadal tries to loop his lefty forehand and send it straight to Federer's weaker one-handed backhand to break down Federer's backhand and win points. And that's pitting Nadal's strength against Federer's weakness. And obviously, in the college application sense, you would do that against an institution's weakness to make yourself stand out. So an example of that would be that it's more advantageous for an engineering whiz kid with science awards to market his strong engineering background to Yale, where not as many engineering majors apply, versus marketing that to MIT, where he would blend into the crowd and be a dime a dozen. Yale, by the way, is a school that gives a strong preference to STEM applicants with national awards. So whenever we have a STEM applicant with national awards and they're looking to apply early to Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, we always recommend they apply early to Yale, because Yale will give you preferential treatment if you're a strong STEM applicant, and whereas the other three schools will not. Let's talk about strategic positioning and building a class. So admissions committees are building a class, and you have to keep that in mind, because top colleges are looking to build a well-rounded incoming class composed of students who are specialists. They're not looking to admit well-rounded students. So the key question is, who are you going to be in the incoming class? What talent or perspective do you bring to the incoming class that no one else brings? Do you have the potential to be a future leader in your chosen field? They're looking for specialists, and when you're designing your application, you have to really ask yourself, what is my area of specialty going to be in the incoming class, and how am I going to communicate that through the application with a theme, overarching theme to my application that communicates the fact that I'm angular and that I'm a specialist. That's really what you have to ask yourself in the application, because they're not looking for students who are the jack of all trades and the master of none. So a really simplistic example of this would be an applicant who is well-rounded with great numbers. So I would say the vast majority of students who come to us are well-rounded with great numbers. And so they have a very hard time getting to the top schools, because the top schools are not looking for well-rounded students with great numbers. They're looking for specialists with great numbers. And so admissions committees at the top schools typically don't like admitting well-rounded students in their incoming class. They want students who are really specialized in one or two areas. And so the strategic positioning in your application, in a very simplistic sense, would be to center your personal statement on a singular passion or intellectual pursuit that makes you seem more focused and specialized and angular, not well-rounded. So let's go over some common case studies. So case study number one, and we work with a lot of students who are pre-med, is the pre-med applicant. And so the pre-med applicant is very, very common in the applicant pool at all elite universities. Let's first talk about the pitfalls of this applicant. So too many applicants are pre-med, and colleges want a diversity of academic interests in their incoming freshman class, not an entire freshman class filled with future doctors. And so one thing to keep in mind is that this type of applicant tends to have a very generic extracurricular profile that can apply to many, many students who are also pre-med. And this profile consists of medical research at a university over the summer, volunteering in the emergency room at a hospital, and your standard medical volunteering and clinical experiences. And so not only is the pre-med applicant overrepresented in the applicant pool, they are also somebody who has a fairly generic extracurricular profile. So it's like a double negative in terms of what you're presenting to the admissions committee. Not only are you overrepresented, your profile is also extremely common, because you have this set of activities which revolves around medical research, volunteering in the ER, and clinical experience. And the most important thing to keep in mind is that you are not applying to medical school. I mean, unless you're applying to a combined BSMD program, you are not applying to medical school. And no one on the admissions committee cares why you want to be a doctor, because you're not applying to med school, and students forget that. So let's look at a case study of a student we work with. So this particular student who came to us was an Asian female applicant, and she went to a very highly ranked and hyper-competitive public high school. She had a perfect 4.0 GPA, taking the most rigorous AP curriculum. She had a 2320 out of 2400 on the SAT. She had done medical research at a university for 1 summer, but no publications or awards. So like a very common profile. A lot of Asian American students have done medical research, but they don't have publications or awards. And she would participate in the Science Olympiad. She was a hospital volunteer. She did varsity cross country. She was good at drawing and submitted an art supplement, which is interesting. And she had a few smaller leadership positions. And she wanted to major in human biology at Stanford, which is the most common pre-med major at Stanford. And so the strategic positioning when the student came to us was very simple. So the human biology is one of the most oversubscribed majors at Stanford and is considered pre-med central. That is a major that you absolutely want to avoid checking when you apply to Stanford, because so many students major in hum bio, you know? And secondly, Asian females are highly overrepresented in the pre-med arena. I mean, there are a lot of Asian females who want to go into medicine, dentistry, pharmacy, etc. And so you're not going to distinguish yourself with that goal. So instead of positioning this student as a pre-med, we removed the hospital volunteering experience from our activity sheet and positioned her instead as an art history major, because art history is an undersubscribed major that almost nobody studies. Stanford has a great art history department, and this particular student would stand out because Asian American students in particular don't major in art history. You know, it's almost unheard of. So art history, like I said, is an undersubscribed major, and this particular student had perfect grades in her history courses and also submitted a strong art supplement, which was our suggestion. And she talked about her independent research project in art history in her application, and her entire application revolved around art history, not wanting to be a pre-med. And so she looked very different from other Asian American applicants who are applying, who typically wanted to go into, at Stanford, computer science, engineering, medicine, business. You know, she looked very, very different. And so the outcome was that this student was accepted at Stanford, and then once she was accepted, she automatically declared human biology as her major, because once you get into any of these universities, you can declare any major you want. That's the rule. And so for the purpose of getting in, though, you don't want to check a major that's oversubscribed, or that people in your demographics too often check, because that will hurt your chances of getting in. Let's look at case study number 2. Case study number 2 is the computer science / engineering applicant, very common applicant in the applicant pool, especially among Asian American and South Asian students. Let's talk about the pitfalls of this applicant. So simply, too many applicants are interested in computer science and engineering, and colleges want a diversity of academic interests in their incoming class. Same story. This student also has a generic extracurricular profile. What do they typically do? They do robotics, they do Girls Who Code, they do AP Computer Science, they do an internship at their parents' tech company, they were self-taught programming languages, and maybe they created an app for a smartphone. So this profile is incredibly common among students who apply to computer science or electrical engineering. This is especially bad positioning for the most overrepresented students in this field, and the most overrepresented students in computer science and engineering are Asian American and Indian male applicants. So if you're an Asian or Indian male applicant, you are held to the highest standard when you're applying to computer science and engineering, because you are the most overrepresented, and you're competing against other highly qualified students who are also Asian and Indian males who have very similar extracurricular profiles to you, which is a problem, you know? And so if you're an Asian or Indian female, it's slightly more advantageous, but it's not as advantageous as it would be if you were a white female applicant with this background. So let's look at a case study of a computer science student that we worked with and what we did to change their profile so that they would have a better shot at getting in. So we worked with an Indian male student from a top boarding school. The student had all A's, taking the most rigorous AP curriculum with only 2 B's. This student had a 35 on the ACT, a fairly typical computer science background, nothing extraordinary. This person did the robotics club, had a 5 on the AP computer science exam, self-taught himself multiple programming languages, you know, and for an Indian or Asian male applicant, that doesn't distinguish you, because too many Asian and Indian male applicants who want to do computer science have done that plus a lot more, you know? This person also did tennis, chess club, speech and debate. Also did an independent project in linguistics. No research or major awards in computer science, and this person wanted to major in computer science at Harvard. And so when the student came to us, we told him, listen, you're not going to get into Harvard as a computer science major because for an Indian male student who wants to do computer science, your computer science background is not that impressive. And so for strategic positioning, we obviously realized that computer science is one of the most oversubscribed majors everywhere since tech and software are hot industries. And Indian males are the most overrepresented in computer science and engineering and face the highest bar for entry into top CS programs. So instead, what we did is we set the student up with a research opportunity with a computational linguistics professor at university. And computational linguistics is an area of linguistics where you apply your background in computer science and programming languages, and you apply that to the study of language. And this particular student used his background in computer science to model Sanskrit language during this research project. And he applied his CS background to study problems in linguistics. Then we had him apply to all major universities as a linguistics major, and linguistics is an undersubscribed major at every university. So if you have a strong linguistics background, a lot of the top schools are going to want you. And obviously, not only is linguistics an undersubscribed major, it's a major that Asian and Indian students hardly ever check. And so we had him write his entire application about linguistics and philosophy, areas that Asian American and Indian students don't go into. And the outcome was that this student was accepted at Harvard and Cornell. And once he was accepted at Harvard and Cornell, he was able to automatically declare computer science as his major. Let's look at case study number 3, another very common applicant. And I call this the business/economics/investment banking applicant. So here are the pitfalls of this applicant. So most top colleges, number 1, do not have an undergraduate business major. So, Dartmouth, no undergraduate business major. Harvard, no undergraduate business major. Yale, no undergraduate business major. Princeton, no undergraduate business major. Stanford, no undergraduate business major. The majority of the top schools do not have an undergraduate business major. So talking about your interest in business is futile at these places because you can't even study business. So, there's no point in talking about your interest in studying business at Duke because Duke doesn't have an undergraduate business major. And the other thing to keep in mind is the last thing that admissions officers want to read about is an application about a student who wants to study economics, get an investment banking job on Wall Street, and get rich, So a lot of the students we work with want to study economics or business, and they want to go into finance, and they want to make a lot of money on Wall Street. It's a fine goal to have. You're simply just not allowed to talk about it in the application. Just keep that in mind. So, and the other thing to keep in mind is that you are not applying to an MBA program. So you're applying to a 4-year liberal arts education. And similar to the students we work with who want to be doctors, students we work with who want to do business, they get so caught up in their own business ideas and what they want to do that they forget that they're not applying to an MBA program. You're applying to a 4-year liberal arts education. So you have to keep that in perspective. Let's look at a case study of a student we work with who wanted to do the management and technology program, dual program at Wharton. And so if any of you are not familiar, the hardest school at UPenn to get into is the Wharton School of Business. And the hardest program to get into within Wharton is the dual program, which is called the Jerome Fisher Management and Technology Program, or most people just call it the M&T program. And it's a program where it's a dual degree program at Penn between business at Wharton and engineering in Penn Engineering, and you graduate with a dual degree. The students who come out of the M&T program tend to get the most sought-after jobs on Wall Street as well as in private equity. So here's a case study of a student we work with. So this Indian male student we work with went to a private high school. He had all A's, taking the most rigorous AP curriculum. He had a 2340 out of 2400 on the SAT. He was a nationally ranked policy debater. He was an Eagle Scout. He had no business experience. And he wanted to enter the dual Jerome Fisher M&T program at Penn and Wharton to study business and engineering, and he wanted to eventually work at a private equity firm on Wall Street. So for those of you who are not familiar, private equity firms are much harder to get jobs at than investment banking firms. So working at a place like Blackstone straight out of college is much more difficult than getting a job at JP Morgan or Goldman Sachs. Strategic positioning. So the M&T program at Penn really looks for 3 things. They look for students with a strong quantitative background. They look for students who take an interdisciplinary approach to academics. And they look for students who have an entrepreneurial spirit, not necessarily business experience, And so What we did for positioning is we set the student up with a research opportunity with an industrial engineering and operations research professor to strengthen his quantitative background and his interdisciplinary approach. And, industrial engineering is very interdisciplinary because it combines statistics, engineering, and business. And instead of talking about his interest in private equity investment banking, which would have been an absolute terrible idea, he spent his application to Wharton talking about wanting to combine his public policy experience through debate with his quantitative background to start a public policy think tank in Washington, D.C., which showed his entrepreneurial spirit. And the outcome was that he was accepted at the Penn-Wharton M&T dual program, and he is currently now applying for private equity investment banking jobs on Wall Street. Case study number 4 is the last case study we'll look at, and this is the combined BSMD applicant. And this is an applicant that we work with a lot because not only do we do college admissions, we also have the leading medical school admissions consulting practice in the country. All of our medical school admissions consultants are former allopathic med school admissions officers. These are people who've been on the admissions committees at places like Harvard Med School, UPenn Med School, UChicago, a lot of the top med schools in the country, and they work one-on-one with our combined BSMD applicants because the criteria for BSMD admissions is the same as the criteria for med school admissions. They look for students with extremely high grades and test scores, especially in the math and sciences, and they look for students who have the requisite research, clinical, and volunteer experiences, as well as a compelling answer for why they want to go into medicine. So here are the pitfalls of this applicant. Too many applicants are pre-med, and colleges, once again, want a diversity of academic interest in their incoming freshman class, not an entire freshman class filled with future doctors. Another pitfall is you have to be accepted to both the undergraduate college and to the BSMD program. So, for example, the Premed program at Brown, the program in liberal medical education, requires you to be accepted to both Brown University as an undergraduate and the Premed program at Brown. And you may be saying that, obviously to get into the Premed program at Brown, you must be a shoo-in for Brown University, and that's not the case because the criteria is different. Once again, Brown University does not like pre-meds. The Premed program at Brown, you have to, in your application, you have to talk about why you want to be a doctor. And so those things are in conflict with one another. And so this is tricky because you must market yourself differently for both non-BSMD programs. So for non-BSMD programs like Harvard, Yale, Stanford, you don't want to talk about wanting to be a doctor. And we already discussed an example of that. We discussed the example of the female applicant to Stanford who was pre-med, but she talked about art history. Versus the combined BSMD programs where it's all about why you want to be a doctor, because applying to the combined BSMD programs is equivalent to applying to med school straight out of high school. So let's take a look at a case study for a combined BSMD applicant. So this particular applicant we worked with, she was an Asian female from a public high school. She had a perfect 4.0 GPA, taking the most rigorous AP curriculum. She had a 34 on the ACT. She had national awards for research on environmental issues. She founded clubs promoting interest in STEM and conservation. She did the hospital volunteering experience. And she wanted to apply to both the top Ivies and to the Premed program at Brown. And so the strategic positioning was twofold. There was a different strategy used for the top Ivies and for the combined programs. So for the top Ivies, we removed the student's hospital volunteering experience from the activity sheet because that screams, I want to be a doctor, and that hurts her. And instead, we marketed this student as an environmental engineering major. Since everything else being equal, female applicants are twice as likely to be admitted to engineering as the equally qualified male applicants. So we wanted to take advantage of that rule. In addition, Asian American students are underrepresented in the green movement. And so it's unusual to have an Asian applicant talk about their interest in conservation. So that's another reason why we positioned this student as an environmental engineering major. And the application for Harvard, Yale, and Stanford for this applicant addressed the student's interest in conservation. There was no mention about medicine at all. And then there was a separate strategy for the combined BSMD program at Brown, the Premed program. We marketed this student, so obviously for the combined program, most people are going to talk about why they want to go into medicine. So we had to distinguish her from other students who want to go into medicine. And so this student had done work with rural medicine, and top med schools are always looking for students who want to practice in rural areas in the middle of nowhere because generally speaking, med students don't want to do that. And so her entire application talks about her interest in practicing rural medicine, and there's a high demand for students who want to be country doctors. And the outcome is that she was accepted to the combined BSMD Brown, Premed program at Brown, the program in liberal medical education, and she was also accepted at Harvard, Stanford, and Yale. So at Solomon Admissions Consulting, we do one-on-one counseling. The details of our advising include obviously working with a former Ivy League or top school admissions officer, and they would be working with you on the personal statement, including the topic and outline suggestions and edits. And the personal statement editing is done by both the former admissions officer as well as our team of editors. Our editors are Ivy League graduates who are professional writers, so these are people who've written their own books and people who've written for the New York Times. They are the ones editing your essays for you. We obviously do strategic positioning consulting, advising students on how to stand out from the crowd and from the rest of the class. We help you with the supplemental essays that are school specific. So we can tell you what every school looks for and how to tailor your application to that school. So for instance, if you apply to Stanford, they look for intellectual vitality. You have to stress intellectual vitality throughout your supplemental essays at Stanford. If you apply to UPenn, they look for students who take an interdisciplinary approach to academics. You have to stress that throughout your YPenn essays. Insider information on college preferences, once again, we can tell you what every top school looks for and how to tailor your application to that school. Shoring up weaknesses, recommendation letters. We give students a very detailed template on what to tell the recommendation letter writers, because the majority of rec letter writers don't know how to write a great recommendation letter. There are ways to write a great recommendation letter that are very teachable to your writers. Extracurricular activity consulting, obviously we coach students on how to maximize their extracurricular intellectual vitality and their academic ratings at these top schools. We also do mock interview coaching and financial aid help. Here is a sampling of our acceptance letters from this past admission cycle. So, quite a few of our students send in their acceptance letters from this past admission cycle, and you can see a sampling of them on our website as well as in this slide. If you have any further questions after this presentation, feel free to call or email us. You can call us at 646-598-8174, or you can send us an email at info@solomonadmissions.com. We provide everyone with a free consultation, and that consultation will take you through your profile and assess your strengths and weaknesses and give you an idea of the things you would need to work on, as well as what we can do to help you get into your top choice schools. That's a free consultation, and you can set that up either by emailing us at info@solomonadmissions.com or calling us at the number listed here. Thanks for coming to our presentation. I'm going to now answer any questions that you may have.